I think the JFK assassination was primarily a CIA plot, and I'm going to deal with 4 elements of that plot here as I see it and present the evidence which causes me to think this. And that's the CIA plot to set up Oswald. And the first part of this is CIA lures Castro into assassination plot by using Amlash to give Castro the message that Kennedy is trying to kill him. The second element here, CIA already knows that Oswald and J.D. Tippit are Cuban assets living in Dallas, so they expect Castro to use them. Castro, the third element, Castro, through the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, employs Oswald and Tippit to kill Kennedy. And the fourth element, CIA infiltrates the Castro plot with Jack Ruby, who manages Oswald and Tippit and maneuvers them as tools in the CIA plot. I'm not going to deal with every aspect of the conspiracy plan, but just this part that the CIA, I presume the CIA, used to set up Oswald and Tippit. I'll have to explain all of that in the video. But first I'm going to deal with the first element, that is the Amlash dangle. Amlash was a Cuban named Cubella, and he was used by American intelligence, the CIA, to lure Castro into a plot to murder JFK. And I'm going to introduce the Amlash topic by reading this piece, this article, which appeared in more than one newspaper, by George Cryle. Amlash is the code name of the Central Intelligence Agency gave to the senior Cuban official it had recruited in 1961 to kill Fidel Castro. The agency's dealings with this hired killer, which continued up to a disastrous end in 1965, encompassed the longest-standing and, on the surface, the most likely to succeed of its numerous plots on Castro's life. It therefore seems remarkable that the Senate Intelligence Committee, in its investigation of the CIA's assassination activities, passed so lightly over this critical chapter. To begin with, any examination of Amlash's history would suggest that he was too close to insanity to be relied upon, and from this a larger question presents itself. Was Amlash actually a double agent for Castro, or was he so emotionally manipulable that he provided an equivalent service? And if so, if Castro had become convinced that the United States would stop at nothing to kill him, could Castro have felt compelled to strike first? Amlash has never been publicly named, but Cuban exiles in Miami have identified him as Rolando Cubella, a Cuban doctor, a former comandante of the rebel army, and an intimate of Castro. The CIA persuaded the Senate Intelligence Committee not to identify Cubella, who was now in jail in Cuba, maintaining that alerting the Cubans to his role in early CIA plots would expose him to reprisals. But this argument is specious. It is difficult to believe that Cubella now has any secrets from his captors. To understand Cubella fully, it is necessary to introduce a Cuban exile in Miami, Jose Ailman. During the 1940s, Ailman's father was perhaps the most powerful man in Cuba. Nominally Minister of Education, his most rewarding coup was to back a truck up to the Cuban treasury and make off with the republic's foreign reserves. In Miami, he bought up most of Key Biscayne. His son chose a different path. Like Castro, he became a revolutionary against the Juan Batista regime in Cuba. While Castro was in the mountains, Ailman was helping to procure arms in Havana for the guerrillas. Ailman worked closely with Cubella, who was then one of the student revolutionaries at the University of Havana. There are many nasty things we had to do, being on the revolution. Ailman reflects, the most difficult was the decision to kill Blanco Rico, Batista's chief of military intelligence. The revolutionary logic of the day called for sparing sadistic officials because of the hatred they aroused. Rico treated everyone like a gentleman. He wouldn't even torture people, Ailman explains, so he had to be done away with. The man assigned to kill him was Cubella. In October 1956, Cubella shot Rico through the head in a fashionable Montmartre nightclub. As he died, Rico caught Cubella's eyes, and Cubella smiled understandingly at him. Cubella escaped to Miami, where he became a hero among Cuban exiles there. But Cubella was tortured by the memory of Rico's dying smile. He was convinced that Rico was talking to him at night, and he had a nervous breakdown. After a few months, Cubella appeared to have recovered and returned to Cuba to join Castro in the Escambre Mountains. Castro welcomed him with open arms. Cubella had always been suspicious of Castro, but now Cubella was one of the towering figures in the revolution with an independent following. Castro needed his support, and therefore made him head of the politically powerful Federation of Students at the university. Cubella exulted in his newfound status as a triumphant revolutionary. He drove about Havana in a gigantic car, drinking and womanizing. He was blissful in his dissipation until he killed a woman in a car accident and again began hearing Rico at night. Ailman, now convinced that Castro was a communist, had decided that Fidel had to die. He says that he went with another revolutionary to convince Cubella to take on the assignment. He was very upset when we came to him, says Ailman. He said, I'm a nervous wreck. I'm just getting better, and now you want me to kill Castro? I don't see the communists, but if I recover, maybe I will. I won't say yes, I won't say no. Ailman was then paying for a psychiatrist for Cubella, and he persuaded the analyst to try to convince Cubella that the only way to exorcise the specter of Rico was by assassinating Castro. The man who accompanied Ailman was José Pepin Naranjo, an old revolutionary colleague who said he shared Ailman's mistrust of Castro. But not long after the meeting, Castro made Naranjo his minister in charge of all police forces in Cuba. The potential for a double cross was obvious. In 1960, several months after talking to Cubella, Ailman went into exile in Miami. He could not trust Naranjo. He was to play no further role in Cubella's life, but Cubella himself had by then become a Manchurian candidate, at least vulnerable to the suggestion of killing Castro, but also a colossal security risk to whoever tried to tap his services, as of course he was being tapped by the CIA at the time of President John F. Kennedy's assassination. In 1963, Cubella asked the CIA if he could do something really significant for the creation of a new Cuba. He said he would like to plan Castro's execution. It was very shortly after this, on September 7th, 1963, that Castro summoned an Associated Press reporter, Daniel Harker, to issue an extraordinary threat. Quote, United States leaders should think that if they are aiding terrorist plans to eliminate Cuban leaders, they themselves will not be safe, end quote. One possible explanation for the warning was the CIA's recent paramilitary activities in Cuba. Operation Mongoose, the secret war that the United States waged against Cuba after the Bay of Pigs, was the product of President Kennedy and his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy. It soon resulted in the establishment in Miami of the largest CIA station in the world, with an estimated 400 American case officers and about 2,000 Cuban agents, charged with the sole task of destroying Castro. But time after time, attempts to overthrow Castro failed. To the frustrated CIA men running the Cuban secret war, it must have seemed an acceptable risk to put up with Cubella's disturbed state of mind. A meeting with Robert Kennedy and Cubella was set for October 29th. Kennedy did not attend, but Desmond Fitzgerald, a social friend of the Kennedys and the CIA man in charge of the Cuban task force, did. He presented himself as Kennedy's personal representative. Cubella was apparently satisfied with Fitzgerald's credentials, for the two arranged to meet in Paris again on November 22, when Fitzgerald was to give him an assassination device to complete plans. At the meeting that day, Fitzgerald gave Amlash a ballpoint pen rigged with a hypodermic needle, the point of which was so fine that its victim would not notice the injection. According to a later CIA Inspector General's report, it is likely that at the very moment President Kennedy was shot, a CIA officer was meeting with a Cuban agent and giving him an assassination device for use against Castro. In a subsequent attempt on Castro's life, anti-Castro leader Manuel Artime, who faithfully reported all of his plans to his CIA control officer, provided Cubella with a silencer and some small, highly concentrated explosives. The two men worked out elaborate arrangements for the murder of Castro. Artime, who led an army of Cuban exiles to land with his commandos as soon as Cubella struck. The assassination itself was to be carried out at Veradero Beach, where Fidel was planning to spend the Easter holidays. Cubella stayed at a house close by. From there, he planned to use the high-powered rifle, but for some reason Cubella wasn't able to complete his mission. It was not until the beginning of 1966 that the Cuban authorities got around to arresting Cubella. He was charged with treason, including the attempted assassination of Fidel Castro. At his trial in 1966, Cubella called for the maximum sentence for himself, to be shot against the wall. But Castro himself intervened on Cubella's behalf to ask for clemency. The would-be assassin was sentenced to 25 years in prison, but is now reported to be at a state rehabilitation farm. This fellow was nothing but a double agent, concluded Senator Robert Morgan, member of the Intelligence Committee, who was briefed by William Colby, then CIA director, on the Amlash plot, but was told nothing of Cubella's earlier history. When Colby told us we'd been meeting with Amlash in Geneva, Paris, and Madrid, it occurred to me, how could the guy get out of a little country like this so easily? Colby said he could do it because he was a high official. I asked Colby who he, Cubella, was really working for, and Colby said, "Senator, that's always a problem." I was struck by how naive these people at the CIA seemed to have been. But perhaps a more reasonable conclusion, based on Cubella's instability, is that even if he were not a double agent, the Cubans were at least able to find out what he was conspiring to do. Senator Morgan, after examining all the evidence, thinks Castro, after hearing of Cubella's plot, first tried to deter the CIA with his public warning. He then retaliated when he learned of Cubella's subsequent meeting with Fitzgerald, now believing the Kennedys themselves were responsible. Just exactly how it happened, I don't know, and I don't know if we'll ever know, he said. But the member of the Senate Intelligence Committee added, "There is no doubt in my mind that John Fitzgerald Kennedy was assassinated by Fidel Castro or someone under his influence in retaliation for our efforts to assassinate him." Now, I don't believe that. I don't think Castro was responsible for the Kennedy assassination. But I believe this part about Castro would have known about what Cubella was doing, and I think he was a double agent. And I think the CIA knew he was a double agent, and that's why they presented Cubella with an assassination plot, which Cubella was told was approved by Robert Kennedy, He was told by Desmond Fitzgerald as a personal representative of Robert Kennedy. And if Robert Kennedy is approving it, then the president must be. So Castro would think that John Kennedy is trying to assassinate him, and therefore would want to respond by assassinating Kennedy first. We do have documents from the CIA relating their dealings with Amlash or Cuba. And this one I'll bring to your attention, where it says Nestor Sanchez, a Spanish-speaking case officer from headquarters acting as case officer for Amlash 1, cabled that Amlash 1 was insistent upon meeting with a senior U.S. official, preferably Robert F. Kennedy, for assurances of U.S. moral support for Amlash's activities in Cuba. And they're talking about assassinating Castro. So Amlash is specifically asking to meet with Robert F. Kennedy, the brother of the president, to get his approval to go kill Castro. I think this is consistent with the idea that Cuba is a double agent. He's working for Castro, and he's trying to find out if President Kennedy is trying to murder him, trying to assassinate Castro. And if he can get Cuba to meet with the president's brother and the president's brother, I mean, you wouldn't expect a meeting with the president himself on this level, and you probably shouldn't expect he's going to meet with the attorney general either, but that's what they're asking for. They're asking to get the word from the brother of the president that the president is really trying to kill Castro. So this would be a way that Castro could feel sure that Kennedy really was trying to kill him. If Kennedy's brother said he was, then he would know that Kennedy was. And I think that's what Cuba is doing here. He's trying to find out if JFK is trying to murder Fidel Castro. But Robert Kennedy did not show up to meet with Cuba. It was Desmond Fitzgerald who showed up. And from this CIA document, Desmond Fitzgerald, chief of SAS, met with Amlash using Nestor Sanchez as interpreter. The cover of the contact plan for the meeting, a copy of which is in the Amlash file, read as follows: Fitzgerald will represent self as personal representative of Robert F. Kennedy, who traveled Paris for specific purpose, meeting Amlash and giving him assurances of full U.S. support if there is a change of the present government in Cuba. According to Fitzgerald, he discussed the planned meeting with the DDP Helms, who decided it was not necessary to seek approval from Robert Kennedy for Fitzgerald to speak in his name. So Castro has sent his agent Cuba to find out if Kennedy is trying to kill him. Cuba asked to speak to Robert Kennedy. Desmond Fitzgerald meets with him instead, saying that he is representing Robert Kennedy, but Robert Kennedy has not been informed of this. That sounds kind of funny to me, that Desmond Fitzgerald will go to meet with this guy saying he's representing Robert Kennedy when Robert Kennedy has not been informed, nor has he given his permission. So I think probably Robert Kennedy would not have approved at this point of assassinating Castro, and John Kennedy probably wouldn't have either. They may have prior to this at some time. I think before the Cuban Missile Crisis, they were trying to kill Castro. But after the Cuban Missile Crisis, there's no evidence that Robert Kennedy or John Kennedy were trying to kill Castro. And here, the CIA is trying to make it look as though he was. And that is to bait Castro into this plot. That is, to starting his plot using Oswald and Tippit to kill Kennedy, even though Kennedy is not trying to kill Castro. The CIA is setting this up. And this CIA document confirms that on the day of the assassination of Kennedy, that Kubela was given the poison pen with which he was to assassinate Castro. Nestor Sanchez met with Amlash in Paris and gave him an assassination device, a ballpoint pen rigged as a hypodermic syringe for the injection of poison. According to the Inspector General report, it is likely that at the very moment President Kennedy was shot, a CIA officer was meeting with a Cuban agent in Paris and giving him an assassination device for use against Castro. Sanchez stated that he received an OPIM cable from Fitzgerald that night or early the next morning, telling him that everything was off. But the IG report authors did not find such a cable in the Amlash file. And this comes from the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. In 1975, they were interviewing the Amlash case officer, who is Nestor Sanchez, referred to in earlier documents. And he's asked, what I'm really asking is, do you think there is any possibility that Castro knew what was going on all of the time? And Sanchez says, that is a very good question, but I have nothing that I could say definitively that he did. It was something that we were always checking, that we were very sensitive to, that we had a double agent, shall we say, on our hands, and we did not give any indication at the time that I was involved with the operation that he had been run into us by Castro. And Senator Morgan says, does it strike you as somewhat unusual that during all of this time, while you were talking about a military coup, you were providing guns and hidden hypodermic needles and etc., that nothing ever came of it? So Senator Morgan seems to be suspicious that the CIA really knew that he was a double agent. So I present this to present the fact that this is not a wacky idea of mine. This is something that back in 1975, the people investigating the intelligence of the CIA, some of them at least, thought that the CIA might have known that Amlash was a double agent and worked with him anyway. And of course, that's what I think. Amlash was a double agent, and Castro was trying to determine Kennedy's intents. And Castro got the message that Kennedy intended to murder him. And so Castro started a plot against Kennedy. And this is a CIA plan to lure Castro into starting a plot against Kennedy, a plot that the CIA intends at this time to infiltrate and to take control of, to make sure the plot succeeds and that they have a patsy to blame, that is Lee Harvey Oswald. They don't just let it happen. You know, some people might argue they wouldn't do this. They just let Oswald kill Kennedy or let Tippit kill Kennedy, and then what's the problem? You know, but they wanted to make sure this plot succeeded, so the CIA made sure that Kennedy was murdered, and Castro is providing the patsy. And now I want to deal with Kennedy's intent regarding assassinating Castro. There's no policy statement in the record saying we shall not assassinate Castro. Of course, at the time, it wasn't known that to the public that the Kennedy administration was trying to assassinate Castro. So it might not have been considered important to make a statement to the contrary. But we do have evidence that the Kennedy administration was trying to assassinate Castro prior to the Cuban Missile Crisis. But there's no evidence of that after the Cuban Missile Crisis. It seems to be an independent CIA plot with Kubela. And this is from Kennedy, one of Kennedy's messages to Khrushchev regarding the agreement to end the crisis. And number one, you would agree to remove these weapons systems from Cuba under appropriate United Nations observation and supervision, and undertake with suitable safeguards to halt the further introduction of such weapon systems into Cuba. We, on our part, would agree upon the establishment of adequate arrangements through the United Nations to ensure the carrying out and continuation of these commitments, to remove promptly the quarantine measures now in effect, and to give assurances against an invasion of Cuba. And I am confident that other nations of the Western Hemisphere would be prepared to do likewise. It doesn't explicitly say we're not going to assassinate Castro, but I think this is a good indication, that is, to give assurances against an invasion of Cuba, that the United States policy towards Cuba is going to change, and one would presume that they wouldn't be assassinating Castro. And we have this July 1964 FBI document giving us something of a retrospective look at this situation. According to Tippit, who is one of their informants, there is now under discussion some plan to kill Fidel Castro, in which Cuba will figure. CIA allegedly was former in favor of such a plan. However, inasmuch as Attorney General Robert Kennedy would have no part of it, it was shelved. Now the plan has allegedly been brought up again for consideration. President Johnson allegedly is aware of it and has not ruled against it. If set in motion, it will be scheduled to occur sometime before the elections in November. For my purposes here, it's important to note that Attorney General Robert Kennedy would have no part of it. This must be a retrospective view from that time that the CIA was dealing with Cuba before, that is when JFK was still alive. And the indication here is that Desmond Fitzgerald was not accurately representing the desire of Robert Kennedy when he okayed Cuba's plot to assassinate Castro. So I take this as evidence that RFK was not trying to kill Castro after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this is a CIA document, memorandum for the record, minutes of the meeting to review the Cuban program. This meeting took place on November 12th, 1963. And I've noted people of interest to me who were present: the President, JFK, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, Director of Central Intelligence, that's John McCone, Desmond Fitzgerald, the man referred to in those CIA documents, who presented himself as a representative of RFK to Cuba. And I happen to note Ted Shackley being there because he was in Dealey Plaza at the time of the assassination. And a presentation of Desmond Fitzgerald is reported here with the details of the covert operations. Fitzgerald is in charge of that kind of thing at this time. And no mention is made of any attempt to assassinate Castro. No mention is made of Cuba or of a poison pen. Nothing of that sort is mentioned at all. And about Robert Kennedy, it says here, the Attorney General commented that he believed the program had produced a worthwhile impact on Cuba during the past 5 months, and that it was useful in the United States as an indication that something was being done. So Robert Kennedy seems to be satisfied with the progress of the Cuban covert operations, and there's been no mention of any assassination attempt, and he makes no request for any assassination attempt. So this meeting, which included the President, Robert Kennedy, and Desmond Fitzgerald, doesn't mention anything about assassinating Castro, and it took place on November 12th, 1963. And this document, which I showed earlier, has two dates on it, October 29th, 1963 and November 13th, 1963. Given the context of what's being referred to here, I should mention this is actually from a 1975 document. This is an internal CIA review of documents, and that was done in 1975. But the documents being referred to are October 29th, 1963 and November 13th, 1963. And given the context of what's in this document, it would seem to be that the second date, that is November 13th, 1963, must refer to the last part of this. That is, according to Fitzgerald, Desmond Fitzgerald, he discussed the planned meeting with Helms, who decided it was not necessary to seek approval from Robert Kennedy for Fitzgerald to speak in his name. So that was the day after the meeting in which no assassination was discussed at all. And the October 29th date must refer to the meeting with Amlash. And, of course, that was before the meeting with the President and Robert Kennedy. And Fitzgerald mentioned nothing about that at all, apparently, at least according to the CIA documents. So what it looks like to me is that Desmond Fitzgerald is operating without the informed consent of Robert Kennedy or of the President when he discusses assassination of Castro with Kubela. And I think that indicates that this is a setup by the CIA. That is, they're trying to get Castro to send Oswald and Tippit to go murder Kennedy because they want a patsy for their murder of Kennedy. So that's the evidence I have, which I say supports the element of the plot, that the CIA was luring Castro into an assassination plot by using Amlash to give Castro the message that Kennedy is trying to kill him, even though Kennedy at that time was not trying to kill him. So the next element of this plot, for which there is supporting evidence, is the CIA already knows that Oswald and Tippit are Cuban assets living in Dallas, so they expect Castro to use them for his plot to murder Kennedy. It's kind of difficult to prove what the CIA knew because there are no documents saying that they knew these things. So I have to go about it in a roundabout way. That is, I think the CIA should have known that Oswald was a Cuban sympathizer, at least, and that Tippit was involved with communist entities. And at the very least, they should have known that. And I think there was probably a lot more to it that it just isn't any evidence for. So I'm going to use the evidence which I can find. This plot, the CIA plot, could be explained without any reference to Harvey. That is, Harvey of Harvey and Lee. But I think there was a Harvey in Harvey and Lee. Therefore, I'm going to explain it in terms of that being the case. And it all starts with Edwin Ekdahl. Marguerite Oswald, who is Lee Oswald's mother, and Edwin Ekdahl married on May 7th, 1945, and divorced on June 24th, 1948. Lee Oswald, during the marriage, is between the ages of 5 and 9. So Edwin Ekdahl, even though he's technically Oswald's stepfather here, is really the only father Lee Oswald ever knew between the ages of 5 and 9, because his biological father had died before he was born. So at that time, Edwin Ekdahl is Lee Harvey Oswald's father. And I think it's interesting that in 1963, when Lee Harvey Oswald is applying for a passport, he writes down the name of his biological father, but under the year of birth, he puts Ekdahl's year of birth. So it could very well be that for the rest of his life, Lee Harvey Oswald thought of Edwin Ekdahl as his father. And this idea is also supported by the testimony of John Pick, Lee Harvey Oswald's half-brother. He said of Edwin Ekdahl, "I think Lee found in him the father he never had. He treated him real good, and I am sure that Lee felt the same way. I know he did. He felt the same way about it because Mr. Ekdahl treated all of us like his own children." So what evidence there is on this topic seems to indicate that Lee Harvey Oswald had a close, positive relationship with Edwin Ekdahl, his stepfather. But Edwin Ekdahl had been married before in Shanghai, China, in 1925, and the marriage certificate says that he has been in Boston and is a subject of Denmark, or a citizen of Denmark. And in 1932, still in China, Edwin Ekdahl has a son, Dewey. And on the birth certificate, it says that the father, Edwin Ekdahl, is a mechanical engineer of Danish citizenship. So, apparently, for several years, Edwin Ekdahl was doing mechanical engineering in China. And I once entertained the idea that Dewey Ekdahl could have been Harvey, of Harvey and Lee, but Dewey Ekdahl was 7 years older than Lee Harvey Oswald, so I don't think that's a possibility. And it was during this time period that the Japanese began messing around with China in the lead up to World War II, and it was actually in 1931 that they invaded Manchuria. And this would give foreigners like Ekdahl a good reason to leave China, and presumably that's why he left and returned to the United States, to Boston. I don't have a complete record of what Ekdahl did when he returned to the United States. I don't even know what year he returned to the United States. But we do have this FBI document, which was made after the assassination. They were researching things, and they went to Ebasco, the company that Ekdahl was working for at the time of his death and at the time he was married to Marguerite Oswald. And it says here, on December 4th, 1963, Miss E.J. Marichello, Personnel Department, Tabasco Services Incorporated, advised Special Agent Roger H. Lee that the microfilm of the employment record of Edwin A. Ekdahl was incomplete, but did reflect the following. Ekdahl died while in the employ of Tabasco on January 26, 1953. Ekdahl's next of kin at the time of death was listed as Elvira Elizabeth Larson, Mrs. Julius Larson, in Boston, Massachusetts. A notation on the record indicated that Mrs. Larson received the insurance money as a result of her brother's death and informed Ebasco she was sending some of it to Ekdahl's son, name unknown. The record did not indicate the area of the United States in which Ekdahl worked from 1943 to 1953, and Miss Marichello advised the Ebasco company would not be able to furnish this information. The only other identifying information included in the above record was Ekdahl's Social Security number. Now, ostensibly, what the FBI was trying to do in terms of the investigation was to find out what Ekdahl was doing at the time that he met and married Marguerite Oswald. But for my purposes here, I'm just going to take from this the fact, as it looks like it's a fact, that Ekdahl was working for Tabasco in 1943. I don't know when he left China or when he returned to the United States, but from this I think we can conclude that he was working for Ebasco in 1943. And on this web page I found this Associated Press report from November of 1942. Big power plant of Reds designed. New York, November 19th. AP, Ebasco Services Incorporated, a subsidiary of the Electric Bond and Share Company, Big Utilities System, is designing a $10 million electric generating plant to be erected in Russia as part of the United States Lend-Lease program. It was learned today. It was understood the U.S. Treasury Procurement Division arranged with Ebasco Services for the blueprints for the big power unit to be built eastward from the present industrial areas. The plant will have 100,000 kilowatts capacity with 4 turbine generators. Total cost was estimated at $100 per kilowatt. So around the same time that Ekdahl is working for Ebasco, Ebasco is working with the Soviets. Of course, this is during World War II. But this introduces the possibility, I think, that Ekdahl may have been involved with this project in some way, and the Soviets may have made contacts with him. And being an engineer, an electrical or mechanical engineer, whichever he was, and maybe he was both, the Soviets might have particular interest in his knowledge of these technical issues. During the marriage, Ekdahl, Marguerite, and Lee would travel all over the country, apparently. We don't have much specific information. I believe this photograph was taken in Arizona. It shows Marguerite and Lee. But apparently Ekdahl was a traveling engineer, and that would make him potentially a very useful contact for the Soviets if he was traveling around the country and making contacts with other engineers or whatever it was he did. That might make him very valuable as a Soviet contact. And as I pointed out earlier, Ebasco could provide no information as to Ekdahl's whereabouts during this period to the FBI, according to the FBI. And while we don't have any direct evidence of Edwin Ekdahl's political sympathies, we know that his sister, Elvira, was a serious anti-capitalist. She was a proponent of the cooperative movement, which shared similar concerns about capitalism that the communists had, though the cooperative movement was not a communist movement. They had similar sympathies for the people versus the capitalists. And there was a time in the 20th century when the cooperative movement looked favorably upon the Soviet Union, though that did change after Stalin's character became obvious to everybody. And his sister Elvira is the same person that, according to Ebasco, Edwin Ekdahl had named to be the beneficiary of his insurance policy. And then there's John Dewey. John Dewey was at one time very well known. He was an American, I think they call him an American philosopher, but he was a very well-known proponent of the cooperative movement. And he very famously was giving talks in China at about the same time that Edwin Ekdahl was living there. And Ekdahl named his own son Dewey, I presume after John Dewey, who was very famous at the time. And so I take this to indicate that Edwin Ekdahl, like his sister, was also a serious supporter of the cooperative movement, which is seriously critical of capitalism and would have something in common with the communists, even though they weren't considered generally to be communists. And this is from the official paperwork of the divorce between Marguerite and Ekdahl. And just reading this part of it, wherefore premises considered, plaintiff prays that defendant be cited to appear and answer herein, that on final hearings hereof, plaintiff have judgment dissolving the marriage now existing between plaintiff and defendant, that defendant be ordered to return plaintiff's 1944 diary and other private papers, for all court costs and for such other further relief, both special and general, at law or in equity, to which plaintiff may show himself justly entitled. And so this is part of the plaintiff's suit, part of Ekdahl's suit for divorce, and it's signed by Fred Korth, Ekdahl's divorce attorney at the time, who, coincidentally, later became the Secretary of the Navy in the Kennedy administration after John Connally left that position. And as this piece shows, on October 15th, 1963, before the assassination, Fred Korth resigned as a result of some scandal that he was involved with. So coincidentally, this guy, Fred Korth, Secretary of the Navy under JFK, had been Edwin Ekdahl's divorce attorney. Anyway, the court did find for the plaintiff, and Marguerite Oswald was ordered to return the plaintiff's 1944 diary and other private papers. And it is my speculation that she returned them personally to Fred Korth, and that Fred Korth read those papers and provided information to U.S. intelligence, I would presume the FBI, and that partially explains his meteoric rise to become Secretary of the Navy, though I'm sure he had other qualities too. But that's my speculation, that it was discovered as a result of these divorce papers that were returned, I presume to Fred Korth, by Marguerite. As a result of that, I think, U.S. intelligence discovered that Edwin Ekdahl was a communist agent, a Soviet agent. Of course, I have no paper to prove that, but that is what I think happened. That is, that in 1948, the FBI knew that Edwin Ekdahl was a dirty commie and that he had been involved with the Oswalds. This would put the Oswalds and Lee Harvey Oswald on the radar of the FBI. And this might partially explain how Marilyn Murret, Lee Harvey Oswald's cousin, became a CIA asset. The CIA has never officially admitted that, but others, including William Gaudet, have said so. Here in an HSCA document, it says Gaudet knows of Lee Harvey Oswald's cousin, Marilyn Murret, in an intelligence connection. And in another document, Bernard Fensterwald says she was Lee Harvey Oswald's cousin, but she apparently did work for the agency. So apparently Bernard Fensterwald already thinks Marilyn Murret worked for the CIA. And Gaudet says she may have worked for the agency in New Orleans, I don't know. I think he's being coy here because in other places he seems to know Marilyn Murret. He even suggests that she be interviewed. So I think we have two people here, Gaudet and Fensterwald, who think she worked for the CIA. And there's this CIA response to the HSCA. The HSCA took the idea seriously enough to ask the CIA for permission to interview Marilyn Murret. So apparently the HSCA was of the opinion that she was some kind of a CIA asset. Of course, the CIA does not say whether she was or wasn't. They just say that they have no problem with her being interviewed. But if she was CIA, it might explain how she became a world traveler on a schoolteacher's salary in 1958, and how she happened to be present with John Pick, Oswald's half-brother, while Pick was stationed in Japan with the Air Force on the very day that Oswald defected to the Soviet Union. That's quite a coincidence. I think she had a purpose there, which I think was to occupy John Pick during the time that Lee Oswald was in the American embassy in Moscow, attempting to renounce his citizenship. I think they didn't want Pick hearing that news. They, the conspiracy, didn't want Pick hearing that news and attempting to contact his brother, because if he had called his brother in Moscow, he would have, and talked to him, he would have realized that it's not his brother, it was Harvey at this time. And so I think the CIA is using Marilyn Murret here because they don't want to interrupt what Oswald or what Harvey is doing in Moscow. They want that to go through because it's part of their plan, even though Harvey is not working for them, as far as he knows. I don't want to get into all of that here, but I think that Marilyn Murret was doing a job here. She just happened to coincidentally be with John Pick in Japan at this very time that Oswald was in the American embassy to renounce his citizenship. So I think it's clear as day that Marilyn Murret had to have been an intelligence asset before Lee Harvey Oswald defected to the Soviet Union in 1959. That is before U.S. intelligence says they knew anything about Lee Harvey Oswald. And if the CIA or the FBI became aware of Lee Harvey Oswald as a result of information they had on Edwin Ekdahl in 1948, that would explain how Marilyn Murret might have become an intelligence asset prior to Oswald's defection. But U.S. intelligence probably wouldn't have been interested in Lee Harvey Oswald just because his stepfather was a dirty red, unless there's more to it than that. And, of course, there's more to it than that. And the more to it is Ekdahl's son. On top here, from Robert Oswald's Warren Commission testimony, Robert Oswald, the brother of Lee Harvey Oswald, he says the first year that we attended there, he's talking about the military academy he and John Pick were going to, and they lived there. They didn't live with the family. Mr. Ekdahl was on the road quite a bit, and they had, during the winter of 1945, gone to Boston, where they stayed, I would say, for approximately 6 months. I understand Mr. Ekdahl had been married and had a son by a prior marriage, and they had lived together, all of them, Lee, my mother, Mr. Ekdahl, and his son, in Boston. However, when the FBI interviewed Dewey Ekdahl in 1963, it says Ekdahl advised that his mother and father separated in approximately 1942, and a short time later his father went to the Fort Worth, Texas area, where he was employed by Ebasco Services of New York City. He commented that his father occasionally returned to the New York City area after that time, and on one occasion told him that he had remarried. Ekdahl stated that he never knew the name of his father's second wife or anything about her. So I think clearly we have a contradiction here. Robert Oswald says that his mother and Lee lived with Ekdahl's son in the winter of 1945, and yet Dewey Ekdahl doesn't remember them at all. And Dewey Ekdahl at this time would have been 13 or 14 years old, and I'm sure he would have remembered a couple of characters like Lee and Marguerite Oswald. And, of course, the Warren Commission never asked the only person who could answer these questions definitively, that is Marguerite Oswald. They never asked her about Boston. So we have a problem here. For some reason, Robert thinks that Lee and his mother were living with Ekdahl's son in Boston, when Ekdahl's son doesn't know anything about them at all. And I think this means that Marguerite, Ekdahl, and Lee were living with a different boy here, and that's the boy we're going to call Harvey. And that's why on my diagram I have a line going from Ekdahl to Harvey and a line going to Lee. I think Edwin Ekdahl is playing father to both of these boys. I don't know who the real parents of Harvey are, but I presume there's a reason for him to do this that has to do with him being a Soviet agent or Soviet asset. I think he's doing a job where he's grooming Harvey and Lee as communist sympathizers. And probably the point is that before Ekdahl ever met the Oswalds, he already was involved with this Harvey. And probably the point is to get an American identity for Harvey. This is something like what John Armstrong says, but it's not exactly what he says. So don't go around saying this is what John Armstrong says. But this is what I think makes most sense with the evidence as I find it. That is, Ekdahl knows Harvey, and he's on a job to get another boy about the same age who can have who has an American identity that Harvey can use, because for some reason Harvey's actual identity is not usable, and I don't know why. In support of this idea, I revisit the topic of the insurance policy payout by Ibasco to Ekdahl's sister, Elvira, who apparently told Ibasco that she was going to send some of the money to Ekdahl's son, name unknown, according to the FBI document. So there's an insurance payout that goes to Ekdahl's sister, that Ekdahl's sister apparently told Ibasco that she gave some of it to Ekdahl's son. Elvira Larson, Ekdahl's sister, had died by the time of the assassination. So when the FBI went a-looking, or pretended to go a-looking, they talked to her husband, Julius Larson. And I'll read in the red boxed area. His wife, Elvira E. Larson, who died in February 1963, was the sister of Edwin A. Ekdahl, who died in 1953. Mrs. Elvira Larson was the beneficiary of a $15,000 group life insurance policy carried by Ekdahl through his employer, and the son, Dewey Ekdahl, was the beneficiary of stocks and bonds held by Edwin Ekdahl. Since Edwin Ekdahl's death, Mr. and Mrs. Larson have assisted Dewey Ekdahl financially with money for his education and a home, and have spent all of the $15,000 on him. Dewey was never told that this money came from his father, and Mr. Larson specifically requested that he not be told now. He stated that Edwin Ekdahl had left the money to Mrs. Larson in payment for many past favors, and that she gradually gave it all to Dewey, as she did not need it herself. So I think that this money probably was spent supporting Harvey Oswald, and was not spent on Dewey. And that Dewey was never told about the money because he didn't get the money, and Larson doesn't want the FBI to ask Dewey about the money now because Dewey doesn't know about the money, and it's just going to create this question in the evidence if they ask Dewey about it. So I think this money was used by Ekdahl to support Harvey and whatever Harvey might be up to. And I also bring up the Bronx Zoo photo in defense of this idea. This is said to be a photo of Lee Harvey Oswald at the Bronx Zoo, when actually I think this is Harvey at the Bronx Zoo. The zoo photo was published in Life magazine on February 21st, 1964, but had been published prior to that in newspapers on December 12th, 1963. And while I don't see any source documented for where these published photographs came from, we do have an FBI document that has Marina identifying photographs, and one of those photographs says it's Lee Harvey Oswald as a boy in Bronx Zoo, New York City. So I presume that the newspaper source for publication on December 12, 1963, came from the photos that had been in the possession of Marina and were at that time in the possession of the FBI. And then on February 12, 1964, the Warren Commission had Marguerite Oswald bring in photographs, and one of those was a picture of Lee at the zoo, according to Marguerite. Mr. Rankin of the Warren Commission says, "If you will permit me, I will ask the court reporter to identify these pictures, and I don't intend to offer them. But then I will ask you each one by number so we can make it clear and then return them to you, so you can tell us what they are about. Is that all right with you?" "Yes, that is just fine, thank you. Now, Mrs. Oswald, I will hand you Exhibits 259 through 269, both inclusive, and ask you to take them starting with Exhibit 259, and referring to the exhibit in each case, tell the Commission what the picture is about." And then when Mrs. Oswald gets to the photo in question, which is Exhibit 261, she says, "This is a picture of Lee at the Bronx Zoo, Exhibit 261, at age 13. That is at the Bronx Zoo in New York?" "Yes, sir." "That is the Bronx Zoo in New York that you told us about?" "Yes, sir." Now, I've underlined here, I don't intend to offer them. What he means is he's going to assign exhibit numbers to these photos, but they're not going to be offered into evidence. They are returned to Mrs. Oswald after her testimony. And if we look at the Warren Commission exhibits here, this is 2 consecutive pages in the Warren Commission volume 16, and we can see that these exhibits are missing. They are not part of the evidence. They're simply assigned numbers for the purpose of the testimony. And so what this means is Mr. Rankin has shown photographs to Mrs. Oswald to get her testimony, but we don't know what those photographs are. That is, they're not in evidence. She's just identifying some photographs, and we don't know what they are. So I think this is sleight of hand on the part of the Warren Commission and Mr. Rankin here. They are making it seem as though she's identifying the same picture that has been published already and is published, I think, 10 days later in Life magazine, and we are to assume from her testimony that she's talking about the same photograph. But because the photograph that's shown to Mrs. Oswald is not put into evidence, we can't know whether or not it's the same photograph. And of course, I think it's not the same photograph. I think she really has a picture of her son at the Bronx Zoo, and that the photograph we know about is actually Harvey, and they're doing this to make it seem as though the mother is saying it's a picture of her son. Of course, she would know her son, but we don't know that it's the same photograph. And you might think, well, if this is a trick, as I say, that is, if they're having Marguerite Oswald identify a different photograph as her son in order to make us think that the published photograph is her son, if that's what they're doing, and they're giving the photos back that they're talking about in the testimony, they're giving them back to Marguerite Oswald, then the problem for the authorities would be that Mrs. Oswald actually still has that picture of the real Lee Harvey Oswald at the Bronx Zoo. But they thought of that. I think they took back that picture from her without her knowing it. That's how I interpret this very strange memo by Wesley Liebler, memorandum to Lee Rankin. Lee Rankin was the one questioning Marguerite Oswald and showing her those photographs that he did not enter into evidence. Anyway, the memo reads, at 9:55 a.m., February 13th, 1964, Mr. John Doyle, counsel for Mrs. Marguerite Oswald, called, spoke to Mrs. Ide, and said he had received a call from Mrs. Oswald advising that she was missing a couple of her papers. Mr. Doyle said that Mrs. Oswald told him that the papers in question were in her file entitled Accident and Defection. The letters alleged to have been missing were letters that she wrote to her son when he was in Russia, which were returned to her. Mr. Doyle indicated that Mrs. Oswald told him that the letters had not been opened after they were returned to her, and that they never had been opened since that time. A copy of the telephone message taken by Mrs. Ide is attached. I was not aware of any of this until I arrived at the office at approximately 2 p.m. Mr. Doyle was here at that time and told me that upon further search, Mrs. Oswald had found the letters which she had first thought were missing. Mr. Doyle told me, however, that Mrs. Oswald now claimed that one other letter was missing. The description of the letter was somewhat imprecise. I discussed the matter with Mr. Rankin on the telephone and with Mr. Schaffer in person and decided that Mr. Doyle and I should go to Mrs. Oswald's hotel room, taking with us copies of each of the documents which Mrs. Oswald had made available to us for copying. We did this about 6 p.m. Mr. Spector accompanied us. Upon our arrival at her room, Mrs. Oswald stated she had found the two unopened letters, which are described in the attached memo of Mrs. Ide's conversation with Mr. Doyle. She also stated the letter which she thought was now missing was one that she had written to Lee while he was in Russia concerning the filing of Lee's income tax return. According to Mrs. Oswald, that letter had also been returned to her, since Lee's address in Russia was unknown at the time. She said she had opened the letter at the time it was returned. Mr. Doyle and I immediately found the original of the letter in question in one of Mrs. Oswald's files. It was agreed by everyone present that such letter was not in fact missing from her files. It was then agreed by Mrs. Oswald, Mr. Doyle, and myself that the only file which had been copied outside of Mrs. Oswald's presence was her file captioned Accident and Defection. That fact is also reflected in the attached memo of Mrs. Ide's conversation with Mr. Doyle. In order to assure Mrs. Oswald that all of the original documents which she had in that file at the time she came to the Commission's offices had been returned to her, we went through the file of copies which I had brought with me and made sure that Mrs. Oswald had in her possession each and every document from which those copies had been made. It developed that she did have all of those documents in her possession. She was completely satisfied at the time Messrs. Doyle, Spector, and I left her room that she had returned to her prior to the time she left the Commission's offices Wednesday afternoon, all of the documents which she had at any time brought with her to such offices. Mrs. Oswald did not at any time or in any way indicate that she thought that any document had been purposely removed from her files. Her only concern was that the 3 documents mentioned above might have been lost or otherwise misplaced during the process by which they were copied. Mrs. Oswald was completely satisfied upon the termination of the above conference that none of her documents had been lost, misplaced, or otherwise removed from her files at any time while she was in the offices of the Commission. Signed, Wesley Liebler. And we also have an addendum by Arlen Specter. The above-mentioned accurately reflects the events which occurred at a conference held in Mrs. Marguerite Oswald's room in the Hotel Willard, which began at approximately 6 p.m. February 13th, 1964. And I'll note here that according to this Associated Press copy, I forget where I got this, but I think it's probably genuine, that Marguerite Oswald's attorney, Doyle, had been arranged through the Warren Commission. The lawyer who first took up the mother's case, Mark Lane of New York City, was not on hand yesterday. That's for Marguerite Oswald's testimony. Mrs. Oswald asked that a new lawyer be provided. Lane was busy on other matters, she said. The commission asked the District of Columbia Bar Association. It designated John F. Doyle, formerly of Kansas City, a highly regarded Washington lawyer, and a former assistant U.S. Attorney General. That's Marguerite Oswald's attorney for this vaudeville skit involving her missing papers. So I think that Lee Rankin, Wesley Liebler, Arlen Specter, and John Doyle conspired together to mess with Marguerite Oswald here in order to steal back her photograph of her son, Lee Oswald, at the Bronx Zoo, and that's why we've never seen the real photograph of Lee Oswald at the Bronx Zoo, and all we have is this photograph of Harvey at the Bronx Zoo. And now I have to deal with the testimony of Robert Oswald, Lee Harvey Oswald's brother. He testified on February 20th, 1964. Mr. Dulles puts them back on the record, and Mr. Jenner says, referring to the 10-day leave in New York City, "Did you spend time with your brother Lee?" "Yes, sir." "Your mother was working during that period of time, was she not?" "Yes, sir." "In spending time with him, did you take him around or accompany him visiting various places in New York City?" "He took me around, sir." "Did you have occasion during that period to take any photographs, snapshots of Lee?" "I certainly can identify the one appearing in Life. Yes, sir, I did." "Just hold your answers right in this area exactly to my questions." "I'm sorry." So here, Robert Oswald is overly eager to talk about the photograph appearing in Life magazine, and I presume, as we find out this is true, that he's talking about the zoo photograph. It's as if Robert Oswald has been rehearsed on this matter, and he wants to get to it. He's eager to get to it, to perform, because he's rehearsed for it. And I think this and many other things indicate that Robert Oswald was cooperating with the authorities in the cover-up. I can't explain why, but he was. And you might notice the date issue here. He's testifying on February 20th. Life magazine, the Life magazine he's referring to has a publication date February 21. So you might think he has knowledge of Life magazine before it was published, but it was common practice back then to publish magazines on different dates in order to make the magazine seem fresh longer. So probably Life magazine that he's talking about had been published a week prior to its publication date. So probably everyone had seen that copy of Life magazine by this time, so that's not a problem. The problem is that he's overly eager to answer this question as if he's been waiting to get to it. Were these taken with your camera, or was it a camera that your mother or brother owned or had? This was my camera. What do these questions refer to? Do they refer to the pictures in Life? Well, I really did not want to refer to that at the moment. So what we have here is Robert Oswald and Alan Dulles, they're both eager to get to this picture in Life magazine, the zoo photo. Why is that? Mr. Jenner then says, well, I really did not want to refer to that at the moment. He wants to present this in a structured, planned way, so it doesn't look suspicious, I think. But anyway, do you remember any of the places at which you took the snapshots of Lee during this 10-day leave? The Bronx Zoo, I believe, was about the only time I can recall taking any pictures of him. So everybody knows there's only one photo in question here. It's the Bronx Zoo photo. But Mr. Jenner's trying to make it seem like it's more random than that. And Robert Oswald and Alan Dulles know better. I am at liberty to advise you, Mr. Oswald, that when your mother testified before the commission, she did produce a number of photographs, snapshots and otherwise, among which was a snapshot of your brother Lee taken at the New York Zoo that she testified was taken at the New York Zoo. Is that the incident in which you took the photograph of your brother Lee, as far as you know? That's a real weaselly question. The photos that we don't know, we never seen the photo that Margaret Oswald was talking about, and Robert Oswald wasn't there to see it. So he's making Robert Oswald identify the photograph shown by Marguerite Oswald as being of Lee Oswald at the Bronx Zoo, even though there's no way Robert Oswald could know precisely what Marguerite Oswald showed the Warren Commission. But anyway, Robert Oswald answers, you say the New York Zoo, sir. As far as I know, there is just one zoo up there referred to as the Bronx Zoo. I do recall, and I still have the picture that I took of Lee at the Bronx Zoo. I certainly feel that perhaps either I sent copies to my mother or to Lee after I had the film developed. So he certainly feels that perhaps they could have the same picture that he's talking about. Mr. Chairman, may I go off the record for a moment? And Mr. Dulles puts us back on the record. For the purpose of the record, I have before me the February 21, 1964 issue of Life magazine. On pages 68A, 68B, and 70, of which there appear a number of photographs. I think it would be well if we gave this spread page an exhibit number, and since it really consists of two separate pages, the next exhibit numbers are what? 281 and 282. We will mark 68B as 281 and 69 as 282. So note here, Robert Oswald does not provide them with this photograph, even though he says he has a copy of it. They're not using the photograph shown by Mrs. Oswald. They're using Life magazine to be the exhibit for this photograph. Directing your attention to page 69, identified as Commission Exhibit 282, there is a picture of a young boy, and the background looks like it might be taken in a zoo. You mentioned that you had taken a snapshot of your brother on this 10-day leave. Could you examine that and see if you can identify that as being the snapshot you took? Yes, sir, I do so identify that picture. That was taken at the Bronx Zoo, a picture of Lee Harvey Oswald, taken during my 10-day leave in New York City in 1953, approximately July or August of 1953. So Robert Oswald, very formally and dutifully, identifies that photograph as being a photo of his brother Lee Harvey Oswald. So the way I see this is that on December 12, 1963, a photo of Harvey got published. And probably the only source for this photo is the photo that the FBI took into evidence, and actually came into evidence as a Warren Commission Exhibit 2, though they didn't use that for some reason. But I think probably the only source for this is a photo that Marina had. And the reason Marina had this photo is because Harvey, of Harvey and Lee, is the one who went to Russia and married Marina, and he had that photo of himself with him, and that's how Marina got it. And before the cover-up could realize what happened here, this photograph of Harvey got published, and then they had to deal with this fact that it was on the public record. And they dealt with it by having Marguerite Oswald identify some photo we never see as a photo of her son at the zoo. And then, the next day, they steal that photograph from her so that there will not exist any photo anywhere of Lee Harvey Oswald at the zoo. The only photo will be of Harvey at the zoo. And then the next day, February 14th, is the date I presume to be the actual publishing date of the February 21st issue of Life magazine. That was the custom, to publish it a week in advance of the printed date. So the photo of Harvey at the zoo is the one that gets published in Life magazine, and they know there's no other photo of Lee at the zoo because they stole that from Marguerite the day before. And then they had Robert appear on February 20th before the Warren Commission to take ownership of the photo, say he took that photo. And I think he probably really did take a photo of Lee at the Bronx Zoo, and he probably had the negative and probably had sent a copy to his mother. And that's why they didn't ask Robert to supply the photos, because they knew it was a different photo. It would be a picture of Lee, not Harvey, and because the picture of Harvey's already been published, they can't have a different photo. So probably Robert Oswald's original photo was destroyed along with the negative, and he took credit for the existing photo of Harvey and claimed that it was Lee. Now, one might wonder what the hell Lee Harvey Oswald was doing in New York City, since he was born in Louisiana and lived most of his life in Louisiana and in Dallas or Fort Worth. So why is he in New York City when he's 13 years old? Marguerite Oswald dealt with this question in her Warren Commission testimony. She said, so then Robert joined the Marines in 1956. Am I correct that Robert joined the Marines? No, Robert joined the Marines in 1952. We are now in Fort Worth, Texas until 1952. So then I decided since I was working, I did not want Lee to be alone. Up until this time, sir, he had a brother. So I sold my home at 7400 Ewing Street and went to New York City, not as a venture, but because my older son, John Edward Pick, lived in New York, and had lived in New York for years. He was in the Coast Guard as a military man. He has now been in the service 14 years, and at that time it would have been approximately 8 or 9 years. I may be off because that is approximately. So he was stationed in New York, so I had no problem of selling my home and going there, thinking that John Edward would leave New York. But the main thing was to be where I had family, and I moved to New York for that reason. About what date was that? This was exactly August 1952, because I wanted to get there in time for Lee's schooling. And if I am not mistaken, Robert joined the Marines in July of 1952, and that was my reason for going. So according to Marguerite Oswald, they're moving to New York City because her son John Pick lives there. And we've got the story from John Pick here. Jenner says, all right, did you invite your mother and Lee to come to New York? The impression that my wife and myself had was that they were coming to visit, sir, and we had nothing against this. My mother-in-law, we lived with her at the time. She was visiting her other daughter, Mrs. Emma Parrish, in Norfolk, Virginia. She was staying with them, so we had the room for them. Just a minute, sir. That is where I began my notes. August 1952. My mother and Lee came to New York. They brought with them quite a bit of luggage and their own TV set. Well, sir, it was but a matter of days before I could sense they moved in to stay for good. And this not being my apartment, but my mother-in-law's apartment, my wife kind of frowned upon this a little bit. We didn't really mind as long as my mother-in-law wasn't there, but she was due back in a matter of a month or so. Did you hear anything to the effect that the reason your mother and Lee had come to New York had anything to do with Lee's being given some sort of a mental tests? No, sir. So they moved out about September 1952. Maybe it was late September, early October, somewhere around there. So from about somewhere between September of 1952 and January 1953, my brother Robert came to New York on leave, and we were all invited up to the Bronx, where they had moved to. So John Pick seems to think they were just coming to visit, and they just moved in. And the time is the same, August 1952. But we have a coincidence here. Edwin Ekdahl, Marguerite Oswald's ex-husband, and Lee Harvey Oswald's father figure, as I conclude, also happens to live in New York City at this time. And I'm using this obituary from a newspaper article to show this. Edwin A. Ekdahl, 57, of 1095 Commonwealth Avenue, Newton Center. Newton Center's in Massachusetts. Died January 26th in New York after a long illness. Widely traveled throughout the world, Mr. Ekdahl recently had returned from Venezuela, where he was engaged in research for his firm. He leaves a son, Dewey E. Ekdahl, a junior at Buffalo State Teachers College, that's in New York, and a sister with whom he made his home, that's the sister in Newton. Services are conducted January 31st at Lucy Stone Chapel at the Forest Hills Cemetery. Now, also, Abasco had said that, as I covered earlier, that Edwin Ekdahl died in New York City while he was employed by Abasco. So, Edwin Ekdahl is living in New York City at the time that Marguerite and Lee moved there. And he actually dies in New York City while they're living there. So I think that's a pretty interesting coincidence. The Oswald family never mentions Edwin Ekdahl again after the divorce. It's as if he just disappeared. But I'm very suspicious that the reason they moved to New York City was because Edwin Ekdahl was there. And this is from the Warren Commission testimony of Myrtle Evans. She was a friend of Marguerite Oswald, who owned some apartments in New Orleans. And she says and she's talking of Edwin Ekdahl here, he was very high caliber, a very fine man, and he had a very fine position. The papers said she was dragged from pillar to post, but that wasn't true. It was his work that took them to places. That's why she went to New York, because of his position. He didn't drag her from pillar to post at all. I don't know what happened to them then, because I didn't see them again. He died, and that's when she moved back to New Orleans. And they stayed in my apartment building. Now, I visited her in Dallas, and I knew Eddie Ekdahl. So clearly, Myrtle Evans is under the impression that they went to New York because of Edwin Ekdahl, and that when he died, she came back to New Orleans. Now, I don't know if she's confused or not. She might be. She doesn't seem to know, though I don't think she's ever asked specifically, that they had divorced. It seems like she thinks going to New York was just part of his travels while they were married. But whatever, Myrtle Evans is Marguerite Oswald's friend, and Marguerite moves into one of her apartments after they come back from New York. So presumably she would have been talking with Marguerite from time to time about New York and about Ekdahl. And I think it's interesting that Myrtle Evans has the impression, presumably from the talks she had with Marguerite, that they had gone to New York because that's where Edwin Ekdahl was, and that Edwin Ekdahl died, and that's why they came back to New Orleans. So I think that one of the things going on in New York City was that this is where Harvey and Lee got together as Harvey and Lee, introduced by Edwin Ekdahl, that they did their bonding there, and that they were being groomed by Ekdahl to be partners as Soviet assets, is what I think. And I think this is where Harvey and Lee get together, in New York City. Actually, I think they had been introduced already in 1945 in Boston, but they were kind of young at that time. I think it's here in New York City that they developed their camaraderie, so to speak, for the cause. And I think probably both of them were at the zoo, and somebody took a picture of Harvey here, and Harvey ended up with that picture, and somebody took a picture of Lee, and Lee probably and his mother ended up with that picture, and we have never seen that picture. All we've seen is the photograph of Harvey, and we see this photograph because Harvey is the one who went to the Soviet Union and married Marina, and Marina had this photograph, and she identified it to the FBI as being of her husband, Lee Harvey Oswald. And I think that explains this photo and all the weirdness around it in the testimony. Now, there are a multitude of references in the evidence to a Harvey or a Harvey Oswald. Most of these can be explained away individually as someone simply saying the middle name instead of the first name. That's pretty common. But this one is a little different from those, and so I'm going to use it as an example. This is Ruth Paine's Warren Commission testimony. Ruth Paine knew Lee Oswald very well because Oswald's wife lived with her, and he came to visit on weekends, and he lived there on the weekends leading up to the murder of the president. And she knew him before that from visiting many times. And while she went to New Orleans, she stayed with them. And in her Warren Commission testimony, that's what they're talking about here. And she says, my recollection is that he was present most of the weekend. He went out to buy groceries, came in with a cheery call to his two girls saying, Yabuchki, which means girls, the Russian word for girls, as he came in the door. It was more like Harvey than I had seen him before. He remembered this time. I saw him reading a pocketbook. So, who is she talking about? She's obviously comparing Lee Oswald to somebody else, and somebody else named Harvey. But there's no other Harvey in her story. And when you examine the context here, he remembered this time. I saw him reading a pocketbook. It's as if Lee couldn't remember Yabuchki, meaning girls. But he had read that. The pocketbook is probably a Russian translation book, and that's why he remembered the word Yabuchki this time. And it was more like Harvey than he'd seen him before. Well, one of the reasons perhaps it was more like Harvey is because he used the Russian word. And Harvey would know the Russian word better because he's the one who went to Russia and married Marina. So I don't think there's any innocent way to explain this. If she's saying the middle name instead of Lee, she's comparing Lee to himself. Unless Harvey is an alter ego, but that's not explained. And of course, Mr. Jenner, the Warren Commission interviewer, did not ask her who Harvey was. This is just unexplained, and I think unexplainable except as being two different people. One is Lee Harvey Oswald, the person she's talking about, and she's comparing him to Harvey, who is some other person. So this is a slip-up on Ruth Paine's part. She knows Lee Harvey Oswald, and she knows Harvey. And she's not supposed to talk about Harvey, but she mentioned Harvey here, and somehow it got through the cover-up censors and made it to the final edition of the Warren Commission report, or the Warren Commission volumes. And another revealing statement on this topic comes from Marina, or comes from this document from J. Edgar Hoover to the Warren Commission. and in it is a copy of a French magazine article, interview with Marina Oswald, and a translation provided by the FBI. And in that translation from the French article, we have this, Marina saying, "I had 2 husbands, Lee, the father of my children, an affectionate and kind man, and Harvey Oswald, the assassin of President Kennedy. I immensely pity Lee, my husband, but I do not feel anything with regard to Oswald, the assassin. That Oswald was a madman." Now, of course, we're supposed to take this figuratively. We're supposed to assume that she's describing the same person here when she says she has 2 husbands, the 2 different aspects of the same man. Of course, I understand that. But since I think there was a Harvey and Lee, and that one of them was actually married to Marina, and the pretense is that the other one was, then of course I see this as being literally true, and I think she's having it both ways here. This is a double entendre. She's enjoying the fact that she's speaking the truth here, knowing that nobody will understand it, I think. She had 2 husbands, Harvey and Lee. And Ruth Paine knew that, and I think a lot of other people did, and I think a lot of these other references we have to Harvey and Harvey Oswald in the evidence really are to a different person. Anyway, I'm saying that's why the CIA already knows that Oswald is a Cuban asset prior to the assassination, because of the Ekdahl connection, because of Fred Korth providing information, presumably to the FBI, who presumably shared information with the CIA, and because Marilyn Murret had become a CIA asset by that time, and no doubt she provided them with information about Oswald too. And I'm also saying that the CIA knew that Tippit was a Cuban asset, so I have to deal with that. And I have 2 elements to the Tippit argument: that he was a known communist, known by the CIA. That is, I think there's a strong argument that Tippit was used in the conspiracy plan as if he had been an enemy of the state, and that therefore he must have been seen to be a communist. That is, he was, in my view, he was designated to shoot the president from the grassy knoll. He was murdered in Dealey Plaza, and an elaborate plan was made to make it seem as though he had been murdered in Oak Cliff, so that Oswald could be blamed for that. And I don't think they would have treated anybody like this unless they believed him to be an enemy of the state, and at that time that means a communist. I think there's a strong argument that he was treated that way, and I'll have to deal with that. I've dealt with that in other videos, but I'll have to go over it again here. And I think there's a tenuous but true argument that Tippit had been associated with a communist saboteur. I think Tippit might actually be seen here as a bigger fish than Oswald. I think they want to kill Tippit as well as Kennedy. Kennedy's the big prize, but I think they want to kill Tippit too, and they want to use Oswald to blame for everything. Oswald is the patsy. Tippit is a particular target, as well as, of course, JFK. As for the strong argument, I'll deal with that first. The evidence is clear that J.D. Tippit was declared dead before he could possibly have been at the hospital where he was declared dead. He was declared dead at Methodist Hospital at 1:15 p.m., but his body is still lying on 10th Street at 1:16 p.m., so he was declared dead before his body had even been picked up. And we know that's impossible, don't we? Because the doctor has to have the patient in front of him to say he's dead, and the doctor is not on the scene, he's at the hospital. Now, the shills and idiots will adjust the evidence according to their biases here, because they want a particular result. They'll make some evidence they'll say some evidence is wrong, and therefore their conclusions are right. But I'm dealing with the evidence as it is, and the evidence as it is clear that Tippit was declared dead before the police officer that was on 10th Street could have been brought to the hospital. So that means that the officer on 10th Street was not Tippit. Tippit was shot somewhere else, and this is a plan to make it look as though he had been shot on 10th Street. But he was actually shot in Dealey Plaza behind the Black Dogman wall. That's why there's a puddle of blood there that has never been explained. You know, as people have said, oh, somebody broke a bottle of soda pop, or it was a snow cone, but that's bullshit. We have people saying it was a puddle of blood. We have this photography, this film, I think it's from the Darnell film, that shows a puddle of something right there where a witness said there was a puddle of blood. This is behind the Black Dogman wall. This would be an excellent position to shoot the president in the head, and I think that's where Tippit was, and that's what he did. And then after he shot the president in the head, someone shot him, and that's Tippit's blood there. So Tippit was actually shot in Dealey Plaza, and the plan was to make it look as though he had been shot a little later, Cliff on 10th Street, so that Oswald could be blamed for everything. They wanted to tie up everything with their Patsy Oswald. On the police radio recording from before the assassination, there is talk of a transfer ambulance being used, but its use is never explained. I surmise that this station wagon here is that transfer ambulance. In 1963, station wagons were used as ambulances. I think this is an unmarked ambulance, the transfer ambulance. And in this film, it's behind the pergola in Dealey Plaza. I think it was planned for it to be there so that J.D. Tippit's body could be put into it, and it could be transported away from Dealey Plaza. I think that transfer ambulance brought J.D. Tippit's body to ambulance 601, which was waiting at Market Hall, and that explains the very strange dialogue between ambulance 601 and the dispatcher. I won't get into the details of that in this video, but the ambulance 601 then, at a predetermined time, took the body of J.D. Tippit to Methodist Hospital. And the plan was that time would line up well with the time of the shooting on 10th Street, but their timing was off. The shooting on 10th Street went off a little late, and therefore we end up with this impossibility of J.D. Tippit being declared dead, as he really was declared dead, before he had been shot on 10th Street. Of course, he wasn't really shot on 10th Street. Somebody else was pretending to be shot on 10th Street. That was Officer Nelson. He was playing Tippit in Oak Cliff after Tippit had been shot and killed already, and he pretended to be shot on 10th Street, and he was taken away by an ambulance on 10th Street. Nelson was a conspiracy tool. He was in Dealey Plaza at the time of the assassination. This is he on Houston Street in the Hughes film. He was not officially assigned here, but he was assigned here by the conspiracy. Here in the Dorman film, we can see he's got his hand up to his hat. He's giving a signal to anyone in the car who's waiting to see a signal. So he was employed by the conspiracy to give a signal on Houston Street. And here we can see him in a Bond photo after the shooting. He is running towards where Tippit's body is behind the Black Dogman wall. You can see that in the background across the street. I surmise that after this he took Tippit's squad car from Dealey Plaza and drove to Oak Cliff, where he played Tippit in Oak Cliff. And any sightings we have of Tippit in Oak Cliff are actually of R.C. Nelson using J.D. Tippit's car. And an analysis of the actions of Ambulance 602 reveals that Nelson was picked up by 602 on 10th Street. The official story says 601 picked up Tippit there, but 602 picked up Nelson on 10th Street and brought him back to Dealey Plaza, where he got back into his own squad car. And then he told the dispatcher that he was in his car at Elman Houston, as according to plan. So now the dispatcher knows that Nelson is up off of 10th Street and back in his own car. So there can be no doubt that Tippit was shot in Dealey Plaza, and the conspiracy wants us to think he was shot on 10th Street. So they're hiding Tippit's involvement in all of this. They're letting him die a hero. They don't care how he's remembered. They just want to get rid of him. In fact, they would probably rather it not be known that a Dallas police officer was a dirty commie, because that would be very bad for morale. So they'd rather just kill him and let him be a hero. And they wouldn't treat some random cop like that, I don't think. I'm not saying there's anything good about the people who rule us, but I don't think they would do that. I think they'd find a different way to set up Oswald rather than to murder an innocent cop. The way this was done was difficult and complex, and they wouldn't have done it this way unless they wanted to murder Tippit. He's not some innocent bystander. They wanted to murder him, and they wanted to murder him because they knew that he was a dirty red. So I think that's a strong argument that the CIA knew that Tippit was a communist, because they wouldn't have gone out of their way to murder an innocent cop. And now to the second element, the tenuous but true argument that Tippit had been associated with a communist saboteur. This is Tippit's job application for the Dallas Police Department, and on his job application he says that his wife's maiden name was Marie Gasway. But if we look at the 1940 census, we can see that the family name there is spelled Gassaway. Gassaway. Apparently this is a name that has many spellings, and to me it seems to be an uncommon name. Maybe it's common in Scotland or wherever it comes from, but it seems to be an uncommon name in my experience. And looking at the 1961 Dallas directory here, because that's the one I have access to, we can see that Gassaway is not very common. There are 3 of them here, 2 different households in 1961 Dallas, so it's not a very common name. So naturally it caught my attention when I saw this FBI document referring to a Gwyn Gassaway. It made me wonder if she's related to Marie and therefore to J.D. Tippit. According to the document, Gwyn Gassaway lives in Dallas, and she wrote a letter to the editor of a newspaper sometime before the assassination, and she received a response regarding her letter to the editor in the newspaper, but sent to her directly. And after the assassination, she thought that the handwriting of that letter she received was the same as the handwriting of Lee Harvey Oswald that she had seen printed in a newspaper photo. And the FBI investigated this, and they say they determined that it was not Lee Harvey Oswald's handwriting. But anyway, Gwyn Gassaway wrote a letter to the editor that was an anti-communist sort of letter, though I haven't found a copy of what she actually wrote. And the response to her, that was sent directly to her, that she thought had been written by Oswald, was a pro-communist letter. So, in summary, Gwyn Gassaway, an anti-communist in Dallas, received a letter from a communist who apparently was living in Dallas, because that's where the letter came from. Now, there aren't many communists living in Dallas probably at this time. We know of one, Lee Harvey Oswald, and I say Tippit was one also. So I'm thinking that maybe Tippit or Oswald, or maybe somebody else they know, has something to do with writing this letter to Gwynn. Now, in other FBI documents, this same person's name, her last name, is spelled differently with Z's instead of S's. She is Gwynn Gazaway. In these documents, definitely the same person. She's at the same address. And fortunately, Gwynn is also an uncommon name, so there's no doubt this is the same person. So this anti-communist, and the reason she's in these documents is because she subscribes to The Worker. The Worker is a communist publication. So this anti-communist is so anti-communist that she subscribes to pro-communist publications. Anyway, her name here is spelled with two Z's instead of S's. And with this spelling, her name appeared in the newspaper on March 17th, 1962. Wife of flyer lives here. The co-pilot of the Flying Tiger plane missing in the Pacific on a flight from Guam to Manila is the husband of a Dallas woman. Robert Gazaway, 38, was married about a year ago to the former Mrs. Gwynn Chandler. Mrs. Gazaway is the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. George J. Greer. So her husband was a co-pilot on this plane that's missing over the Pacific. This was a famous airplane disappearance. It was an airplane carrying military personnel to Saigon to fight the communists from North Vietnam, and it blew up mid-flight. The cause of the presumed crash and disappearance was never officially determined, but the evidence makes it seem like it was either sabotaged or shot down by another plane. So Gwynn Gazaway was married to a co-pilot on this flight, and the official accident report misspells her husband's name as Gazaway. So this name keeps getting misspelled everywhere. It's misspelled by the FBI. It's misspelled by the Aeronautics Board here. And it makes me think that maybe they're misspelling it for a reason. With the digital age here and the internet, it's pretty easy to catch these misspellings. But if back in the old day, you probably never would have been able to put Robbie J. Gazaway together with Gwynn Gazaway, and the suggestion that maybe they're related to Marie Gazaway, who is the wife of J.D. Tippit, the only other person murdered on the day that JFK was murdered, or in this particular case. So it may be that it's being intentionally misspelled here. So I think that possibly Robbie Gazaway was a communist agent, and he helped to bring this airplane down somehow. Yes, apparently he died in the crash, so that's not certain. I don't want to get into every little nook and cranny of this story here, but that's what I think. And Gwynn Chandler had married him just a year or two before this. They had a baby who was stillborn, and she's a big anti-communist, and she had been married before too, and so I think she might have been a CIA or an FBI sent to marry Robbie J. Gazaway, and she was successful in her mission, and she probably, because they suspected him of being a communist agent and they wanted to keep track of him. I don't have any documents that support this, but this is just my speculation. And he did live in Dallas before this happened. We can see in the 1961 Dallas directory that he was living here So I think Gwyn Gassaway was seen by Tippit as a kind of in-law. I guess she would be kind of an in-law to his wife, I guess you'd say. But anyway, some kind of a relative who wrote a letter to the paper criticizing his beloved philosophy, his beloved communism. So he, or someone he interacted with, wrote her a letter directly in response to her letter to the editor. That's my theory. Anyway, this would mean that Bob Gassaway, whom I say is a communist agent of some kind, could have interacted with J.D. Tippit. So this is my explanation for how J.D. Tippit could have become a communist, and somehow I think Oswald found him in Dallas, and that's how they got together and how they were became available for this Castro plot. That's the tenuous argument. I view this argument not as proof, but as an explanation. That is, I think Tippit was involved. I think he shot the president. I think he was involved with Oswald. And so I have to explain that. And I think the explanation is that he was related through marriage to Robbie Gassaway, who was a communist agent who brought down this airplane that was on a military mission to South Vietnam, and that U.S. intelligence knew that, even if they didn't publicize it, and that's how they knew that Tippit was a communist agent in Dallas. And they probably have other sources, too, that I don't have any evidence for. So it doesn't bother me that this is a tenuous argument, because to me it's an explanation, not a proof. And there's other evidence to connect J.D. Tippit to Lee Harvey Oswald. I'm going to use this because it's just so hard to remember all this stuff. So I'm going to use my wacky little diagram here. Alan Tippit, to the left there, was J.D. Tippit's son, and he was seen, or a boy was seen with Oswald at the Clifton Chastain barber shop that I think was Alan Tippit, with Lee Harvey Oswald. So the way I see this anyway is Alan Tippit, J.D. Tippit's son, who was just short of 14 years old at the time, was hanging out with Lee Harvey Oswald. And according to Chastain, this boy was spouting communist propaganda at a barber shop in Dallas. And also, Alan Tippit, according to my analysis of the photography, was in Dealey Plaza at the time of the killing. So it looks to me like Alan Tippit is a communist asset because of his father. And then J.D. Tippit had been seen at the Dobbs house with Lee Harvey Oswald 2 days before the assassination. J.D. Tippit had been the neighbor of Carl Mather and was still friends with Carl Mather at the time of the assassination. Carl Mather worked for Collins Radio. Carl Mather had worked on LBJ's airplane. Carl Mather owned a car, which probably is the car that Lee Harvey Oswald was seen driving at the furniture store there some months before the assassination. And Carl Mather did the same kind of work as those soldiers, the specialists on that airplane that was brought down. He did the same kind of work they did, very specialized kind of radio work, and I think he probably knew some of these people. And he probably was motivated to help U.S. intelligence take down J.D. Tippit. So I think he's cooperating with U.S. intelligence here to in this plot, because he has been told that J.D. Tippit was involved with his airplane being taken down, or involved with the person who took down this airplane. Of course, I don't know exactly what Carl Mather might have been told, but I think he's probably cooperating with the conspiracy here because he's a friend of J.D. Tippit, who's a dirty commie who helped to kill his friends. So he wants to help the government catch Tippit, I surmise. I don't want to get into the 1961 Ford here, but there's an awful lot of suggestion that J.D. Tippit is involved with Lee Harvey Oswald. And I think for good reason. I think because he was involved with Lee Harvey Oswald. And maybe it's worth mentioning here that when the HSCA interviewed Mac Pate from the Mac Pate garage, and I don't want to get into the significance of him as a witness here, but he was a significant witness. He told them it's common knowledge that there's a Ruby Tippit Oswald conspiracy, had been from the beginning. So, according to Mac Pate, it's common knowledge that Tippit and Oswald were involved together. What that common knowledge is based on, I don't know, but I think it's correct. So I think there's so much smoke to this fire that if the CIA didn't already know that Oswald and Tippit are Cuban assets living in Dallas, that they should have, and the FBI should have, and they would have told the CIA about this, I think. So I think it's pretty clear that the CIA must have known, even though I don't have a document that says so. They must have known that Oswald and Tippit were Cuban or communist assets living in Dallas, and therefore they would expect Castro to use them in the plot that they've lured him into committing. They probably have other information, too, that indicates that there aren't all that many Cuban assets in Dallas. There probably weren't that many, and I think Oswald and Tippit would be standouts, and they would be expected to be the ones to be used. And maybe the CIA was infiltrated in this plot deeper than I know about. I think Jack Ruby was their infiltrator, as far as I can tell. But maybe they had other infiltration, too. Maybe they actually controlled the selection of Oswald and Tippit somehow that I can't know about. So the next element of this plot for which I find evidence is that Castro used the Fair Play for Cuba Committee to direct and support Oswald and Tippit in the plot to kill Kennedy, in his plot to kill Kennedy. Actually, the evidence is more for Oswald because I don't have any evidence that Tippit had anything to do directly with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, but I think he's involved with Oswald, so I think it applies to both of them. And I'll start with this. It's an FBI document, a letter from J. Edgar Hoover to Rankin of the Warren Commission regarding Vincent T. Lee. Vincent T. Lee, at the time of the assassination, was the chairman of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, an organization partially funded at least, by Cuba and Castro. And in here it says, on March 26, 1964, a confidential source of our New York office, that is an FBI source, who has furnished reliable information in the past, advised that Vincent Theodore Lee, former director of the National Office of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, had related similar statements that President Kennedy was actually assassinated by Dallas police officer Tippit, and that a week before the assassination, Tippit, the head of the John Birch Society in Dallas, and an unnamed third party, possibly Oswald, were together in Jack Ruby's nightclub. Lee reportedly obtained his information from other individuals previously active in the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Lee stated that while Oswald was an advocate of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, he had also joined a number of anti-Castro movements and was therefore in a position to know everything on both sides of the issues involved. When Vincent T. Lee was later directly or questioned by the FBI, he knew they were FBI, he denied any inside knowledge. But I think this implies that he did have inside knowledge, and because I already think Tippit did shoot JFK, I think it's significant that Vincent T. Lee thinks that Tippit shot Kennedy and that he was involved with Oswald and Ruby. And I think this reflects inside information that he knew because he was the director of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. and other people involved told him these things. So I think this means that some people in the Fair Play for Cuba Committee knew that the plan was for Tippit to shoot Kennedy. They may not have known the CIA side of the plan, but they knew the Cuban side of the plan. And the idea that Tippit shot Kennedy was not a common theory at all, at least not outside of Dallas. So I think it's significant that Vincent T. Lee seems to believe this gossip, or whatever it is, because it's not the kind of thing that people were thinking generally. And yet, according to other evidence, as I have shown, I think Tippit was probably to shoot JFK. He was certainly in position to do so. And it's very strange, therefore, that Vincent T. Lee would think he did if he didn't have inside information that he did. So if it is known in the Fair Play for Cuba Committee that Tippit shot Kennedy, as apparently it is, then that would mean that the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in some capacity was used in the Cuban side of the plot. And then there's Richard Gibson, who had been the head of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee before Vincent T. Lee took over. And this is from 1962, when he attempted to get a job with the CIA or the FBI, a paid job. He wanted a paid job. And he told them that time was running out. It was a matter of life or death. And this was in the summer of 1962. This was shortly after Oswald had returned to the United States. And to me, it looks like, in retrospect, that Gibson has become aware of some violence being planned by the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, perhaps involving Oswald, and he's offering his services to the FBI and the CIA. He had written the CIA first, and he wants to get paid, and they don't want to pay him, apparently, so they don't accept his offer. And then we have this intercepted phone call. It was intercepted by Swiss authorities and provided to the CIA. It's not clear to me exactly when the phone call occurred. Obviously, it's after the assassination, upon news of the assassination becoming aware to Gibson. And this is after Gibson has left the Fair Play for Cuba Committee and left the United States. And apparently he's talking to somebody who would be a Fair Play for Cuba Committee sort of person, and he's not talking, he hasn't been hired by the CIA yet, or the FBI, so the persona he would be using would be one that is pro-Castro when he's talking to this person, presumably. And he says, yes, or the unknown individual says, sincere condolences, just the same. And Gibson says, yes, and this also, the guy was one of ours. Now he's talking about Oswald, as Oswald has been shown in the news. He is a nut, the other person says. I was exchanging correspondence with him. He is a nut, a former Marine. This may have unbelievable consequences. Yes, Yes, I am not unhappy either. But this is not the way whereby minds can be changed. You understand now, if they want to engage in a campaign to invade Cuba, there are no longer any problems. It is very serious. Yes, but also is a fellow who was called to my attention 2 years ago because he was arrested for having shouted, "Long live Fidel," in the streets of Dallas, Texas. There was quite a hubbub at the time. He wrote letters to me and became a member of the committee. And at the bottom here in the conversation, Gibson says there is nothing to, for example, all this correspondence has been destroyed for some time now. I have burned everything. And this has never been officially acknowledged that Oswald wrote to Gibson and there were correspondences which Gibson burned. It's in this conversation, this telephone conversation, which is candid because Gibson doesn't realize that he's being listened to by the authorities here. But anyway, it says, and it says 2 years ago, Gibson's talking about. That's about the same time that he was in contact with the FBI and the CIA wanting to work for them for pay because it was a matter of life or death. So this is the same time that he's talking about life and death that he's in communication with Lee Harvey Oswald. I think that's probably not just a coincidence. That is, I think probably Oswald was telling him about some kind of plan to shoot somebody or something. And that's why he was saying time is running out and it's a matter of life and death, because Oswald was going to kill somebody. Now, we do have Gibson here saying that he burned all of his correspondence with Oswald, and we don't have any letters from Oswald to Gibson or from Gibson to Oswald in the evidence. So the shills and idiots might be tempted to say he's just making this up. But there is an envelope in evidence from the Fair Play for Cuba Committee to Oswald from the summer of 1962, which proves that Oswald was in contact with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, presumably with Richard Gibson. So this is proof that there was a correspondence there, though the letter that had been in this envelope is not part of the evidence. So we don't have any of the actual correspondence, but we know it existed, and we know that Gibson had told somebody, apparently candidly, that he had burned all of the correspondence he had with Oswald. And apparently Oswald destroyed all of the correspondence he got from Gibson too. Either that or it disappeared some other way. But when Gibson eventually talked to American authorities, he had never heard of Lee Harvey Oswald. He had had some correspondence with a Lee Beaumont. In fact, he had never written Lee Beaumont a letter either, according to this. But this Lee Beaumont was in Fort Worth, and that could kind of sort of cover him saying that, if whoever made this document knew that the phone call was going to be on the record, this kind of sort of covers that, but it doesn't really cover that. And that phone call is never mentioned in the documents. Again, he's never confronted with what he said in that phone call. So this isn't really resolved here. It's kind of patched up, and it's obviously a patch. And then in this 1965 FBI document, we find out that the CIA is telling the FBI that it now is directing the activities of Richard Gibson. So he has got his wish. From before the assassination, he was trying to get hired by the CIA, and by 1965, he has been hired by the CIA. And we can see in documents, which are still heavily redacted, in the last version I've seen, in Gibson's personnel file, that the CIA was cultivating a relationship with him from the time after that phone call had been intercepted. But there's no evidence that they were employing him before the assassination. And this is how that phone call had originally been redacted. I don't know the history of its release to the public, but apparently the first time it had been released, it looked like that. So the way I see this is that in 1962, Gibson tried to warn the CIA and FBI about Oswald and his homicidal intentions, But he wants to be hired and paid for his information, and he is therefore refused. In 1963, the post-assassination intercepted phone call where he talks about having interacted with Oswald. And then in 1964, I believe, the CIA hires Gibson to keep him quiet about Oswald. It's not clear exactly when they hired him, but they did start paying him as soon as they started talking to him after he had talked to the American embassy in Paris. So I think the CIA paid off Gibson, essentially, to keep him quiet about his relationship with Oswald. And to the purposes of my video here, I think this shows that Gibson, being the head of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, knew that Oswald had homicidal intentions, and therefore that this was something that was going on within the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And that's Castro's conduit to Oswald. That's the way I see that. At the time that Gibson was concerned about Oswald, it might not have been JFK that they were targeting. It might have been General Walker. However that may be, I think this shows that the Fair Play for Cuba Committee was used by Cuban intelligence for operations. And now to Gilberto Lopez. The photograph here is from an airport security camera in Mexico City, and the document is a retrospective CIA document from 1976 documenting the chronology of activities of Lopez that they were aware of. I'm going to start on 17th November 1963, 5 days before the assassination. Lopez was at the home of one Mary Quist in Tampa, Florida, where he and others saw photos of Cuba related to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Lopez indicated at that time that he had been refused to travel back to Cuba. I take this as meaning he's being controlled from Cuba. That is, they won't let him back in just yet. November 20, 1963, 2 days before the assassination, Lopez attended a Fair Play for Cuba Committee meeting in Tampa, Florida, and at that time was expecting a call from Cuba in order to get word on his departure for Cuba. Same day, Lopez received Mexico tourist card for 15 days in Tampa, Florida. He was listed as being single. So what this means is he's been given the means to return to Cuba. That's what this tourist card is going to do for him. It's going to allow him to enter Mexico from the United States. So I interpret this as meaning he's got his instructions and he's got his means to travel, his travel pass. November 23rd, 1963, the day after the assassination, Lopez crossed the border into Mexico at Nuevo Laredo by car. Car belonged to another person, unknown. 23rd November 1963, according to Enrique Ruiz Montalvo, agent of the Federal Judicial Police, that's Mexico, one Gilberto Lopez was involved in the assassination of President Kennedy, and that this Lopez entered Mexico on foot from Laredo, Texas, about 1200 hours on 13 November, it must mean 23 November, with passport number issued July 13, 1960, and proceeded by bus to Mexico City, where he entered the Cuban embassy. According to this source, Lopez left the embassy for Cuba on 27 November 1963 on Cubana Flight 465. Lopez was issued travel form at Nuevo Laredo. 25 November 1963, Lopez checked into the Hotel Roosevelt in Mexico City at 1600 hours local time, room 203. 27 November 1963, Lopez checked out of his hotel and at 2100 hours departed for Havana on Cubana Flight 465. That's where the photo was taken. He was listed as the only passenger along with a crew of 9. On 3 September 1964, it was reported that Lopez, still in Cuba where he is not employed, but merely spends much of his time playing dominoes. So it sounds like Cuba is pleased with his performance in whatever he did, and that he doesn't even have to work for a living. Gilberto P. Lopez Rodriguez has two brothers, one known as Solito, who was in Cuba with the militia. Lopez reportedly stated upon his return from Cuba, date unknown, that he had trouble with a militiaman. Lopez's other brother is one Raimundo P. Lopez, who was sent to the Soviet Union by the government of Cuba to study. So this indicates that the Lopez family is well regarded by the government of Cuba. I think it's clear from this timeline that Lopez was involved in some way in the assassination, that he was being controlled from Cuba through the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And I think probably he was supposed to pick up Oswald and escort him to Cuba, but I can't know for sure what he was doing. Anyway, I think this is consistent with my third element here, that Castro was employing Oswald and Tippit through the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, and Lopez was another such person who was being controlled through the FPCC. Now, moving along to the last element here, Jack Ruby. Of course, there are no documents showing that Jack Ruby infiltrated any plot for U.S. intelligence, but I think it's pretty clear that he wasn't working for Cuba. If he really was some kind of a Cuban asset, I don't think he would have lived as long as he did. So all I have to do is demonstrate that he was involved in the plot, and the only reason he'd be involved in the plot would be if he was working for U.S. intelligence, or maybe for Lyndon Johnson or something. Let's start with a rumor. As I showed earlier, Mac Pate told the HSCA investigators it's common knowledge that there's a Ruby Tippit Oswald conspiracy. It may be a rumor, but this is locals many years later. They probably believe this for a reason. I don't know what their reasons are, but the locals often know things that the rest of us don't. That's not proof, but it's something. And we have some information here from Thayer Waldo, who was a journalist. Of course, anybody who doesn't like this information will attempt to discredit the source, but I think Waldo is a fairly honest journalist on this matter. And Waldo is quoting persons he has interviewed. The names are given here. But he's quoting Ruby as having said he was in it with both sides regarding Cuba, meaning pro-Castro and anti-Castro. And it says here, Ruby further stated at that time that I can get a personal knockdown to Castro anytime I want it. So I think this shows that Ruby was in position already from 1959 on to be a double agent working for American intelligence, because if this is correct, and I think it is, Ruby could work both sides of the Castro thing, and that's what you need a double agent to be able to do. And we have this Department of Justice document from 1947, which includes a sworn statement from a staffer working for Richard Nixon at the time, in which it says, "It is my sworn statement that one Jack Rubenstein," which was Jack Ruby's birth name, "of Chicago, noted as a potential witness for hearings of the House Committee on Un-American Activities, is performing information functions for the staff of Congressman Richard M. Nixon, Republican of California. It is requested Rubenstein not be called for open testimony in those aforementioned hearings." So, in my view, this demonstrates that Jack Ruby, and there's every other indication in the evidence of this, that he is willing to cooperate with American authorities on investigations, and in this case an anti-communist investigation working for Richard Nixon, when he's persecuting communists at this time. There is a story from Roger Stone, which I will not use as evidence because I regard Roger Stone to be a not credible person. But you can look that up yourself if you like. So Jack Ruby seems to be just the sort of person that American intelligence could or would use in an operation involving a Cuban operation, because he's willing and in position, therefore able to serve such a function. And willing and able double agents are probably pretty rare, so they would use Jack Ruby if they needed to use somebody. And here we have some evidence of Jack Ruby having gone to Cuba at the end of 1962 and the beginning of 1963. This comes from an FBI document, but what it actually is a letter to the media, to the press, from the Directorio Revolucionario Estudiantil. They were an anti-Castro student group. And in this letter it says, Jack Ruby, the man accused of killing President Kennedy's assassin Lee H. Oswald, stayed in Cuba during 1962 and the beginnings of 1963. Ruby flew to Havana from Mexico City. During his stay in Havana, Ruby was a habitual visitor at a Cuban souvenir store located across the street from the Sevilla Hotel in Prado Avenue. This store belonged to a man named Solomon Pratkins. What is important to me here is the time that Ruby is in Havana. It says during 1962 and the beginnings of 1963. And this is evidence pertaining to Lee Harvey Oswald's location at the time. This is a postcard that Oswald wrote to his brother to thank him for a gift he had sent for his daughter. And it's dated January 10th. And it says, well, what I've underlined, it says, I was out of town for a few days. And so apparently he wasn't home at Christmas, and he didn't get home until somewhere around January 10th when he responded to his brother. So what this means is that Lee Harvey Oswald was out of town, that is out of Dallas, at the time that Jack Ruby went to Havana, or at the time that Jack Ruby was in Havana. Now, Lee Harvey Oswald is a poor person. He's not going on vacation anywhere. We know of him taking no significant trips. We know of him taking no trip at this time. We only have this postcard which says he was out of town, and it just happens to be the same time that Jack Ruby was in Havana. And it just so happens that Vincent T. Lee, the head of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, also happened to be in Havana at this same time, according to this CIA document. So this doesn't prove that all three of them got together in Havana to plan the assassination, but it proves that they all had the opportunity there. That is, the only one we know didn't go, or the only one we don't have any evidence saying he went to Havana is Oswald, but he is oddly out of town at the same time. So I think they all three went to Havana, and they met with their Cuban contacts, whoever they were, and this was in order to prepare for the upcoming assassination of the president. So I think this information supports my fourth element here, that is that Ruby is infiltrating the Cuban plot by going to Havana and meeting with the two Fair Play for Cuba Committee people, that is Oswald and Vincent T. Lee. But I have no reason to think that J.D. Tippit went to Havana. But I don't think that's necessary for Ruby to infiltrate the plot. Now, Ruby's involvement in the plot has to be gleaned because the CIA are professionals and they're not going to leave an explicit paper trail as to what happened. So let's do some gleaning here. This is from an FBI document about an interview with a George B. Bray. That's a strange last name. And if we look at this teletype, which generally precedes the FBI reports of interviews, we can see that George B. has a normal last name of Gray, but for the document we have here, they've changed his name from Gray to Bray, and it seems to me pretty damned obvious that that is to hide the identity of this witness. If they had changed it from Bray to Gray, maybe that's an honest mistake, I don't know. But changing it from Gray to Bray, a name that nobody has, I think is a dishonest mistake. And anyway, in this document, Bray lived at the Neely Street address that Oswald lived at for a while. And in this document it says, on occasions, Oswald and his wife quarreled, and these quarrels occurred in the presence of an unknown male visitor who utilized the back stairs to visit the Oswalds. This man is described only as a white male having a chunky build. Of course, there are lots of white males with chunky builds, and we're probably supposed to think this was George de Mohrenschildt, because we know of George de Mohrenschildt being a friend of the Oswalds and visiting the Oswalds. But de Mohrenschildt said in his Warren Commission testimony, yes, and we were too busy. We saw them. We withdrew also to an extent. You see what I mean? We saw a lot of them at the beginning, and then we stopped seeing them. Then we saw them again for Christmas and invited them to another party, and that is all. Then we saw them the last time for Easter. I am not defending myself for having seen them, but that is a fact. So what he says here is that he saw them after Christmas. He only saw them one time, and that was for Easter. And that's the only time he could have seen them at the Neely Street address, because they moved there after Christmas. So if George de Mohrenschildt is telling the truth, he can't be the male visitor that George Bray is talking about, because this is something that Bray says happened multiple times. And so I think this is probably Jack Ruby, because he fits the description. And you could argue, well, someone else might fit the description too. And yes, someone else might. But the only people we know of involved in this story that would fit that description who might be visiting Oswald are George de Mohrenschildt and Jack Ruby. So I think it's Ruby. And I think that's why the FBI changed George Gray's name to Bray, because they didn't want anybody asking George Gray who that was. Now, there is some evidence that Jack Ruby knew J.D. Tippit. Of course, he knew a lot of policemen, so that might not be surprising. But anyway, we have this FBI document of an interview with Larry Crawford, who was one of Ruby's employees. And it says, it is Crawford's definite recollection that he was in the presence of Jack Ruby when the news came over the air concerning the assassination of President Kennedy and the death of Officer J.D. Tippit on November 22, 1963. At that time, Ruby referred to Officer Tippit by his first name or a nickname, probably J.D., neither of which Crawford can now recall. He said he knew him quite well. He definitely was referring to the Dallas, Texas Police Department officer Tippit, who was shot on the day of the assassination. And it says he definitely was referring to the Tippit who was shot because there, believe it or not, are other Tippits on the police force. And Ruby claimed he was talking about one of the other Tippits when he talked to the Warren Commission. And when Crawford talked to the Warren Commission, this got softened a little bit. He doesn't sound as definite on this point as he does here in this report. So I think this is probably indicative of the truth. That is, Crawford remembers Jack Ruby knowing who it was who was shot, and that this story was dulled a bit so that we wouldn't take anything from that. And I think Ruby definitely knew that Tippit was the Tippit who was shot. J.D. Tippit was that Tippit because he's the one who shot him behind the Black Dog Man wall in Dealey Plaza. And I think this is Jack Ruby in the Bothan photo, the person generally called Shadow Man. I think he's walking away from the scene here after having handed the second handbag to Mrs. Chisholm, the one that had the gun in it that Tippit had used to shoot Kennedy, that she took away from the scene. So I think Ruby actually shot Tippit and was well aware of which Tippit had been shot. And there is evidence that Ruby was at the Texas Theater when Oswald was arrested, and I think he was there, and that's why we have the bogus Seth Cantor account of seeing him at Parkland Hospital. I don't want to get into the details of all of that, but I think Seth Cantor was a tool of the FBI, and that he said this about Ruby. The point was to prove he wasn't at the Texas Theater because they knew he was at the Texas Theater, and they knew that George Applin saw him there. But Applin didn't say so till 1979. In this article, he says, when authorities questioned Applin, he testified in detail about Oswald's arrest in the theater slightly more than an hour after the assassination. What he didn't tell them, however, was that he recognized Jack Ruby as one of about 4 main floor patrons not identified by the Warren Commission. I think this makes sense in the story of Jack Ruby being involved with the assassination plot as a double agent. And I think probably Gilberto Lopez's job, whom I mentioned earlier in this video, I think probably his job was to meet Oswald at the Texas Theater and then escort him to Cuba. Maybe he even was in the theater at the time of the arrest, but there's no evidence that I know of that says so. So that covers the CIA plot to set up Oswald, as I see it. The CIA lured Castro into making his own assassination plot, knowing that they would use Oswald and Tippit in this plot, and then the CIA had this plot infiltrated using Jack Ruby, perhaps other people too, and they controlled the plot and used it to kill Tippit and to kill Kennedy and to set up Oswald as the lone nut patsy, and then, of course, to kill him. Your tax dollars at work.